Hi everyone, welcome to the Incuto podcast. I'm Andrew Rabbitt, I'm the CEO of Incuto, and I'm really excited to welcome Liz Barclay, financial journalist and broadcaster, Commissioner at the Financial Inclusion Commission, Chair of the Fair by Design campaign, and many other roles as well, to discuss today's discussion. Liz, thank you so much for agreeing to join us
Pleasure.
on this. And can I just say congratulations, by the way, on your recent announcement about your role as the first female small business commissioner.
Yes.
It's very exciting.
Well, I do have to point out that I'm actually the second small business commissioner. So I may be the first. I may be the first woman. There has been an interim small business commissioner as well as a small business commissioner before me, and they've both been men, admittedly. But it's not too bad that actually we've had one male, one female, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely.
In the actual prescribed role. So I'm very excited about it.
Well, let's start there. Why don't you tell us a bit more about that role and a bit about yourself and your background?
Well, the Small Business Commissioner, obviously, there's a clue in the title, and it is about small businesses, but the remit is quite narrow at the moment. It's more focused on trying to get businesses paid on time. There has been, and I think it is improving, there has been a late payment culture to a certain extent in the UK. And small businesses, of course, at that end of the supply chain, the really small businesses are the ones that struggle if they don't get paid. And if I just give you an example, I always pay my crews. So if I take a film crew out, for instance, I pay them the next day or the day after, but they don't have to wait for their money. But I've been in the position where I've then had to wait for the money coming in from the client. And in one particular case, I think it took 94 days for the money to come through. Now, that means that I'm taking all of the risk in the meantime, that that money's not going to come through, that I have paid a huge chunk of it already in advance of receiving it to the crew, but at least the crew can feed their kids. And to me, that's extremely important. And I think, it does come down to that in some cases. The Small Business Commissioner has, in the past, been dealing with situations where small businesses, people, owners running small businesses simply didn't know where the money was coming from to feed the kids over the weekend. So we do have to think as to how we make that better for small businesses and get big businesses to understand that this is really important. And of course, if you lose that small business from the end of your supply chain, then the skills aren't there next time around because they've gone. And the Federation of Small Businesses reckon about 50,000 small businesses a year may go to the wall because they're not getting paid on time. So it's a big, big issue.
Absolutely. It's like a poverty premium for businesses.
Well, that's a nice segue, Andrew.
There you go.
into the poverty premium, yes, which is another one of my roles, which is Fair by Design. Now, Fair by Design is both a campaign to stop the poverty premium and a fund which is there to help businesses design out the poverty premium, if you see what I mean. And the poverty premium is that bit extra that you pay because you're too poor, have too little income to be able to pay by direct debit, for instance, which might give you some discounts. So you're actually paying more because you have the least income. And somehow or other, that doesn't seem very fair. So the campaign is trying to change that with existing organizations. And the fund is trying to help innovative small businesses come up with ways of designing a better way of delivering the product or service so that it doesn't cost more for the people who can least afford to pay more.
Absolutely. For full disclosure, of course, Fair by Design is one of our investors. So just for the sake of the record,
the fund
is one of our.
Yes, absolutely. But I don't have any say in how on the decisions that are the investment decisions that are made for the fund. I chair the steering group that says, what can we help you with, guys? How can we help you to find the businesses, for instance, that are innovative and might want to come along to the fund, or how can we help you to influence people to think through whether or not there's a better way to design your products and services so that the poorest don't pay the most.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting because there seems to have been quite a lot of focus on that. And then obviously with the last year and the pandemic hitting, that's kind of, I guess, brought a much sharper focus into certain areas of that, like access to affordable credit and even things like access to cash. That's changed a lot of the perspective.
Yes. And all of that is about financial inclusion. We don't want people to be excluded from the products and services that everyone else can benefit from. And if you think about it, there are 2 million people approximately in the UK that don't have access to a bank account for all sorts of reasons. So we need to think about how we can stop people being excluded by the processes from the services that they need, and how they can get the advice to give them the best products and services to meet their needs throughout their lifetime as a consumer of financial products and services. But also there's a tie in here with digital inclusion, because if people are excluded from digital services, so they can't get online, for instance, or they don't have the skills, then they're probably going to be excluded from some of the better financial products and services that would meet their needs better. So I think the two are fairly linked. And to a certain extent, that's your job.
Well,
just sort of, Andrew.
yeah, we'll fix that. It's interesting though, isn't it? Because one of the experiences that we've had is about this idea that digital transformation is about taking people away from a face-to-face contact, away from humans, and just putting it all online. And from day one, really, I've had this real focus on saying, actually, it's nothing to do with that. Digital transformation is about bringing in new customers, potentially younger customers, who don't want to do the stuff that you're forcing them to do in a branch right now in a branch. They want to do that online. So you should give them that experience because that's what everybody else is doing. But that just removes them from the queue so that you have time to help people who genuinely need help. And it seems to be that the banks are kind of moving away from that model of going, oh, well, you can just do all of that online. It's great. You don't need to come into a branch anymore. But the sector that we're trying to represent in terms of credit unions is very focused on that kind of, they're firmly planting themselves into the high street as everyone else is retreating, because they know that face-to-face service, and it feels like that's something that's actually going to set them apart in a positive way in the future from everybody else, and represent an area of growth, I would hope.
Well, I do think that there'll always be people who want face-to-face. But the other thing to bear in mind, I think, is that sometimes people will want to just simply go online and do whatever they have to do because that suits them. But then they might have a future transaction that they want to see somebody face-to-face. So I think the mix is always going to need to be there. And certainly this is a great opportunity for the credit unions. But as you say, to a certain extent, why not take out of the queue the people who can do it for themselves, are happy to do it for themselves, don't want to have to go physically into a branch, or for whom, frankly, it's not possible to go into a branch. There are an awful lot of people who, maybe they're in rural areas where they don't have their own transport and public transport isn't great. So, to be able to do your banking transactions or your credit union transactions or whatever online really saves you that angst of thinking about, well, how am I going to get there? Am I going to get a neighbor to take me? There are people for whom digital access is better, should they be able to, should they have the broadband and should they be able to acquire the skills. It actually would be better for some people. I mean, I think the oldest online banking client, new banking client last year was 94. Because he said, well, why am I standing in the rain in the queue for the bank to open? Because the bus has dropped me.
Nice.
At 5 to 9 in the morning. And so I have to wait for the bank to open when I can do it this way. But that's not to say then that there aren't lots of people who still aren't in that position, don't have access, but also for other more complicated transactions may need to see people face to face. So it's about trying to get that balance right, but remembering that every step you take to making your services exclusively digital may be excluding a certain raft of people. And what
it's interesting,
do you do
isn't it?
about them?
Yeah, it's really interesting that bit, isn't it? Because it's a constant source of amusement in my head that you get the high street banks sell off branches and they get changed into wine bars, and everybody sort of identifies that and goes, "Isn't that ludicrous?" And then you get the really exciting new challenger banks that come along and go, "Great news, we don't have any branches." And then suddenly somebody gets a check, and they go, "Well, what do I do with the check? Where do we put that?" And there's no hole in the side of the phone for the check. So then you have to keep innovating that sort of problem out. One of the most exciting things, because if you think about that kind of high street presence, one of the most exciting opportunities I think that we've looked at is about this integration with the post office and just got connecting local services, people that you trust, people that you like, somewhere that you would go anyway, alongside all of those. So you don't need a branch on every high street, but you need a place you can go that you trust and that can service the requirement. I just think that's a really big opportunity that kind of gets missed. And I know you can do that with the high street bank. And for us, it's always about the digital is really important because it puts everybody on a level playing field. And you're right, if you live out in the middle of a field or, wherever in a rural area, that's great as well. But it's that thing of, well, you just expect that to be the case. And I always look at this. I don't know how you feel about this, but I always look at the credit union sector and think it's primed for a new group of people coming through who have a social conscience, who are ethically minded, and who are staring at everybody else and thinking, I just don't really want you to have my money. I don't really understand what you do with it. I don't understand your motivation for it. And if you can bring everybody up to a level of service that says, look, you can do that online, you can open your account, you can move between it and do all those kind of things, which is very different to history. It's very different to where our parents were and all the things that they could access, which also means it's very difficult to educate people about. I mean, it's sort of a multiple dynamics. It's exciting and fun, but also very different to anything that's happened before it.
But those multiple dynamics lead to multiple behaviors, lead to the need for multiple choices as to how you do your banking, how you access your money, how you manage your money, and all the rest of it. I was smiling at what you said about the wine bars, because if you wander around our towns and cities, come on, banks have been changing into wine bars for decades.
Absolutely.
All these beautiful buildings now make beautiful wine bars. And I was smiling when you talked about the checks, because my 20-something friend got a check a few months ago, and she looked at it and she went, she's from New Zealand, she looked at it and went, "What's this? What do I do with this?" And then discovered, of course, that all she had to do was go into her banking app, take a picture of it, and off it went. So again, you see, there are people designing ways that you can manage all of those things. But when you come back to needing services on the high street, for instance, what about small businesses? Small businesses that handle cash and cash up at the end of the day, where are they going to put it? They need somewhere that they can go and hand it over. Or, and I think there used to be, by the side of those beautiful big banks that are now wine bars, there used to be little drawers that you could, and a hatch, and you could put your money in. And of course, that's all gone now too. But this is what I'm saying. You've got to think about, if you're going to go digital, that's great for some people, but what do you then need to do to still remain accessible to others? And those young people, those raft of new people coming through that you mentioned, they're here. They're young people. Credit Union Futures is something that I've been involved with for several years now. And it is about the young people coming into the sector, into the credit union sector, for all sorts of reasons. Maybe because their parents have always had a credit union account. Maybe because it really suits those ethics that you're talking about, and they feel that they want to make a difference. There are some amazing young people have gone through the credit union CU Futures program, where they do a whole raft of different projects during the year. They have all sorts of different training during the year, and they graduate at the end of the year. and are really, really proud to do so. And of course, it's the thing that makes me most emotional. And every year at ABCO conference, I cry because they're so brilliant. And they're really, really focused on what they can do to bring the credit union movement up to date, because there's an awful lot of customers get a service from Amazon, so they think everybody else should be able to give them the same level of service. But they're also about what the future products and services should look like. What will the needs of the customers be in the future? And how you don't exclude anybody from that. And I just feel that the credit union movement is in such safe hands because we've got such a raft of really keen, passionate, compassionate people coming through, young people. Absolutely fantastic. If you haven't met them,
I think we have. I think we met some of them, certainly. And, it is really exciting to see. Because I think part of the perspective of this is that you mentioned that Amazon experience. I mean, that's what we came into. We came into the market to go, actually, people are just used to the idea that when you click order, within 3 seconds, you've got an email confirming that you just ordered something. It just told you that you did something. And if you don't see the email, you panic and think, maybe you didn't get my order. You log back in and check it. And so the expectation is so high that, and it's been set by everybody else, Facebook, Amazon, Google, everybody has kind of set that expectation of how you interact with something, that if you don't do it, it's almost just the benchmark of it's just an okay service if you do that. And I think including small businesses and everybody have had to really step up to that.
Especially during COVID. I think that has made a world of difference. Somebody said to me the other day, we've actually shifted 10 years of technological development into 90 days.
Absolutely. And some people did it overnight.
Change. Some people did. Absolutely astonishingly did it overnight.
Well, it's really funny. We had a local supermarket that had never done an online order in its life. I think the idea of online ordering would have scared it into submission, who suddenly launched an online kind of service where you could go and order and go pick it up. Which was kind of a seismic shift, and then suddenly a home delivery service. And now, a year later, they've got not only an online ordering system, but loyalty points and all sorts of other things that have been built in along this journey that's the big supermarkets took 10 or 15 years to evolve into. And these guys, this small supermarket, done it in sort of 6 or 8 months, which is quite incredible, really.
They need the skills to be able to do that. And the problem, I think, that a lot of people are finding is it wasn't as easy to shift online as they thought it might be. But then it was really difficult to find the people with skills because they're all already employed. And you do need quite a bit of help to help you do that. And so I think this is why the government is looking at much more training for small businesses around about management skills, digital skills, building that digital infrastructure, etc. Because it's here to stay. It's not going to go back in its box. The genie's out of the bottle now. So people aren't, we'll do a mixture. We'll work from home more. We will go back to the office, but we may not go back to the office 5 days a week. Things have shifted. And when things shift like that, they very rarely go completely back to what they were. So I suspect there will be a lot of people continue doing their online shopping because they've got used to doing it now. And you mentioned access to cash earlier, which is another area that's really worrying because people shifted to doing their banking online at the beginning of the pandemic, and there was a lot less money taken out of cash machines. But also a lot of businesses stopped taking cash. And that meant that some people who had no option, didn't do online banking, found it really difficult to go and pay for ordinary things, essential things that they really, really needed. Can you imagine being homeless on the streets at the start of a pandemic and, people give you cash and then you can't even go and get yourself something to eat because the cafes and so on have stopped taking cash because everybody else is doing digitally. So, we have to be really, really careful as basic a system as that we don't push people out of it completely when they're not ready to be able to operate in any other way. So I think there's a big drive, the government is looking really hard about how you keep access to cash, because it costs about 5 billion a year to run the cash network. And of course,
it's a huge cost.
The big banks and so on don't want to have to pay for an infrastructure that fewer and fewer people are using. So,
Absolutely.
sometimes there's a social policy role here as well as just the business rule.
Yeah, and it's something that I think especially during lockdown, became a really crucial kind of dynamic, didn't it? That actually, well, there were two things that I noticed. One was that in terms of the credit union sector, there was just an expectation that the credit unions would stay open. Like nobody's kind of sat back and went, "Oh, it's perfectly fine that you would close." They all went, "Well, of course you're going to stay open, and of course you're going to be there for us because we need you."
But don't you think that was the local expectation almost? Because you wanted your corner shop open too. You wanted to be able to pop in and do. And I think there was an expectation that a lot of community-based businesses would be there for you, and the credit unions were.
Yeah, and to their credit, they absolutely were, despite the obvious challenges. But I think the other thing is around that piece around financial education as well, because we've done projects like Lifesavers, where it's about school banking and children in primary schools and teaching them about cash, because they're going to migrate into using plastic cards and doing all sorts of other stuff. But it's about sort of bringing people along on this journey. Going back to that point about this over our lifetimes, our parents and the way they've behaved and our children and the way they'll behave are so vastly different in terms of the way so that thread of education that goes through how you use something. I mean, I always remember my dad getting paid by check, right? He was a builder, and we used to have this game in the house where he'd come in and drop the envelope, and he'd say, "Oh, it's going to be a good week this week." If the envelope fell quickly, gravity hadn't existed in our house up to that point. So we had this kind of dynamic where money was a thing because it was a finite resource, and it became part of a kind of game in the house to talk about it, because then you'd know whether it had been a good week or a bad week. If it snowed, it was going to be a bad week. If if the sun was shining, and it was going to be a good week. And there was all that kind of stuff that went on. But that was an education in a sort of weird form. But it's completely different to tapping a card, because I have no idea how many times I've tapped that card. I don't know how much I've spent until I look in an app. And it's such a massively different experience.
And you can get into debt very quickly by tapping that card. But also, you take the kids to the supermarket and you use the card to pay, and you go out with groceries or whatever you've got with you, and there's no money changes hands.
Yeah, nothing tangible happened. Just use the card.
Yeah. And it's just that card. It's that piece of plastic. So what does that mean? Do kids think about it as just being the magic money tree? But then again, you see, I'm not sure, because I think there's a lot of households have really, really, really struggled. I mean, let's face it, if you were on 2 wages, lost both your incomes and ended up in universal credit, the shock of realizing you have to exist on £94 a week is horrendous.
Bizarre.
Absolutely awful. So there's so many households where they've had to spend all their savings. They've used up every resource they possibly have got. They've had to borrow from friends and family apart from anything else. And then on the other end, you've got the households that have been lucky enough to work at home, keep the jobs, and haven't spent so much because they can't go out for meals. They can't go to the pub. They can't go and, but they can still buy clothes online, I suppose. Yeah. But, that you need less because you're not going out to the office.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Those families have saved quite a bit of money. Now, there's thinking going on that it'll be like the roaring 20s and we'll all go a bit bonkers because if we've got money, we're going to go out and spend it. I'm not so sure that necessarily will happen, because I think there might be a bit of thinking now around about the rainy day fund, the emergency fund, what would happen if we ever...
What happens if it happens again?
Yeah. And anyway, you can't buy last season's clothes because you don't need them.
Yeah, that's right.
Who are you going feral.
Yeah, that's right.
The only thing I'm longing for is the hairdressing appointment on Monday morning.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. I've never had hair. It's just it just grows in sort of bits along the way. But yeah, absolutely. It's a funny thing though, isn't it? Because obviously, in terms of the way that everything sort of shifted, in a lot of ways, there's been a lot of positive things that have come out of it in the way that we started to behave. And I think that's definitely going to be one of them. With the, credit union balances have gone up, savings balances have gone up. People are obviously sort of taking better choices. I say better, not necessarily better, but they've had less things to spend on, less aspirational things. People aren't buying cars, and not going on holidays, and not doing those kind of things. But there is certainly a sense that people have become acutely aware of their incomes and outgoings and the choices that they have to make. And I think there's been such a huge amount of coverage of the scale of damage that's going to cause, and especially people thinking about that number. Imagine if you had to live on £94 a week, could you do it? And I mean, I couldn't do that. I mean, it'd be an absolute disaster, I think, in my household. But it is really, it affects so many people I mean, how do you see that sort of impacting the work that you're doing across other areas?
Well, we've paid down an awful lot of debt. We've paid down billions and billions of debt, be it, whether it's been debt on credit cards or it's been debt on mortgages and so on. So a lot of people have put a lot of money up against their debt, and a lot of people have more savings. And I think there might just be that bit of a cultural shift. But the other thing I think I am beginning to hear people saying, and these would have been people who possibly would have been quite critical of the welfare benefit system in this country, who are now saying, I had no idea. I didn't realize, watching queues form at food banks. And I think there is a bit of a feeling of shame that we've allowed the country to get to that situation. Now, that doesn't say that we won't come out of this with deeper inequalities, because I think we will. And that's horrible. It's a horrendous thought. And how do we get a better balance back? I mean, the government's talking about Build Back Better, but what does it actually mean? We haven't seen any detail yet. We really need to know what it is they're going to do to get underneath those inequalities. But there's also, I think, a more compassionate feeling in that I'm talking to people who are saying, how can this be? I didn't realize it had got like this. I didn't realize that people I know would have to use food banks. I didn't realize that people I knew were going to have to live on that kind of money because the welfare benefits are so small. So it's really hard because, of course, the government's going to have to try to pay back before the interest rates go up. All that money that it's borrowed. The very spectre of interest rates rising must be giving the Chancellor sleepless nights.
But it is interesting, though, isn't it? Because I agree with you. I've had the same experience of people kind of recognizing suddenly, and actually, I think there's a lot more communication around it. There's a lot more thinking around it, and people talking about it, newspapers covering it, all that sort of thing. And one of the really interesting sort of dynamics that I've seen is that this sudden dawning realization that this didn't just happen because of 2020.
No.
That people aren't just suddenly queuing outside a food bank because we had a pandemic. They're kind of going, geez, these things existed before this, and they've existed for a long time. How have we genuinely allowed that to happen?
Exactly. There was the structural element in all of this that really fed into it. It was exacerbated by the pandemic. But if you think about the inequalities in terms of not just the financial inequalities, but think about it in terms of all sorts of people with protected characteristics, which brings me back to the fair by design stuff in the first place. We know that people with disabilities, we know that people from different ethnicities, etc., can find it really, really difficult to get insurance, for instance, quite often because they live in the areas most at risk. So, of course, the premiums go up to reflect the risk. And then they can't afford the insurance in the first place, despite the fact that they're living in an area of most risk. So how do you then replace all your worldly belongings if, you're burgled or you're there's a fire or something like that? So, and that in itself is a real poverty premium in that. Everything gets pushed up and it is much too high in terms of affordability. So we really need to sit and think through the structural elements that we've created. Credit unions, fantastic, but we've lost mutuality out of most of the financial services sector. insurance was based on pooled risk and mutuality and so on. Now it's based on algorithms and AI and who's the greatest risk and who's the least risk. And we've
it's interesting
another thing I just want to mention before we run out of time is the ABCUL inclusivity group. I mean, we've started to look at whether or not across the credit union movement we have enough of the people who reflect the makeup of the customers that come to the credit union movement. So quite often you look at the picture of a board, for instance, of an organization, and you say, well, nobody there looks like me. So why would I go and connect with, interact with, transact with that organization? Because they won't understand my needs. And I think that in order to be fully inclusive, we need to be able to show that we have people on boards, on forums, on whatever it happens to be, who really are representing the people that we have as our customers. And I think that's really important, but it's important across the board. And, we're going to have inequality at social level if we continue to have no recognition of what it really means to be inclusive at board levels, organizational levels.
It will sound really rude and ungrateful, but you and I have had the privilege of being sat in some very, very nice places talking about poverty, probably eating food that people that would have fed a village.
Absolutely.
Not fed everybody a bacon sandwich, and looking at that question and looking around the table, they're all the wrong people to be answering the question about how to fix poverty, right? Nobody. There's a very large number of relatively privileged people sitting around a table discussing how to help people who are in a very different position. And I know there's a lot of talk around that idea of lived experience, but it really is a big challenge. I think that when you are trying to solve a problem, that you don't involve the people who are suffering the problem.
But you're never going to get the understanding of the problem if you don't talk to the people who. But this goes right back to when I first got involved in the charity sector eons ago, and we had organisations that were always for people.
So
absolutely. We had the Royal National Institute for the blind, for the deaf, etc. And actually, people saw it that way. You did see the boards of some of these organizations thinking that they knew what was best for people, whoever the organization they were. And that has really changed in the charity sector, but it hasn't necessarily changed in some of those boardrooms in the city or, in insurance companies or pension companies or whatever. And until we really are inclusive and representative of the people we're there to provide products and services for, I'm sorry, we're not going to get it right.
And it's really subtle things, isn't it? It's like you can go to a challenger bank and get the kind of orange colored card, or the silver, the one made out of wood, or the one made out of some metal somewhere. And there's even that kind of stratification where people talk about the services that are available and are inclusive, but the product is different.
Yes.
The card looks different. It's got a different logo on it. It's got a different design on it, as if to kind of stratify you are different. And just the approach that you can take to something and the way that you're included is by default different. And there might be really good design reasons for that. But actually, I heard somebody say at one of those aforementioned, sort of privileged rooms, I heard someone once talk about, I think you were probably there, somebody once talk about the idea of dealing with people with non-standard needs. And you go, given how many millions of people there are in that position, or how many more do you need before it becomes a standard requirement to be able to help people who need more help, or people who have
it is this question of exactly what is normal. It's such an awful word.
I'd be offended if somebody called me normal.
Well, I wouldn't even wouldn't even think of it.
Exactly.
But my sister-in-law has just written a book for kids, and it's all about inclusivity. And it was born of her hatred of the word normal. And it's all about being different and how important that is, and how important it is to have to have that range of thinking around a table. And unfortunately, if you're always choosing people who think the way you do, then you're never going to get any different input or any different challenge or any different way of thinking within the organization. And you're always going to be catering for the same sector. Now, of course, lots of businesses have to choose the sector that they cater for, but the credit union movement doesn't, and isn't, and is increasingly much more aware of who is using its services, and therefore how we get all of those people included at the decision-making levels, so that they have a voice. People need to have a voice.
It's really interesting for me because coming from a technology kind of background, I always and we sit around the same tables and talk about these things, and it always serves as amusement to me that so much money is invested in tools and things that people can download and use on a smartphone that are effectively a kind of personal treasury management. It tells somebody how rich they are today, but the tools that are specifically designed for people who are wealthy. They've got money. It's just reminding them how much they spent on coffee, not trapping them from falling off the edge of a cliff. And a very smart person who I've done one of these podcasts with before, Ian Brewer, once gave me this this analogy of the credit unions are there for they're building fences at the top of a cliff, not investing in ambulances at the bottom of it. So we're there to stop you from falling off it in the first place, not picking you up when you get to the bottom. And I really like that as a kind of visual thing, that they're there to protect people and the way that they operate. But these kind of services that have been designed out for people who are really wealthy seem to be the kind of services that would actually help people, if they were designed in the right way, help people to avoid getting into difficulty in the first place, rather than just sort of serving a market of people just as a wealth management tool, effectively.
Yeah, but the two problems we need to address are that the fact that at the boardroom level, we've got to make sure that those people who might fall off the cliff are in there. Are in there. And secondly, we've got to make sure that the customers, the members who come along and join credit unions, are from all different backgrounds too, because we actually need people putting money in order to have money to lend. So we've got to make sure that it isn't just seen as a bank for poor people, because then the people with any kind of liquidity won't come along and say, let's save this into a credit union because it's doing a really good thing, instead of let's push this into some kind of wealth investment that I don't know anything about, and somebody else will manage my money. And I think we need to get that ethical message across, that this is an alternative here. There is another way of managing your money. But we've also got a big social policy issue, because there are an awful lot of people who just simply cannot manage to save anything. They're on deficit budgets. They cannot afford to pay for the essentials. And so at that end, they've already fallen off the cliff, and the ambulances aren't there waiting, and that worries me hugely.
It's really interesting that, because there's been a real stigmatization over the last sort of 5-10 years of this concept of benefits, and I'm a bit of an obsession. I'm a bit of an obsessive when it comes to words, and we always used to call it welfare. This kind of idea that it's a safety net, that you shouldn't be able to fall beneath a certain level. And then suddenly we started calling it a benefit. And that has a very different connotation, like I'm entitled to something. And actually, there is that notion that people take a very different view of people who are living in what they perceive to be, well, I should be entitled to this and this and this. And they take that view, and it's portrayed in the TV, it's portrayed in sort of documentaries around the way that certain people are living, and they're exploiting that system. But that's such a tiny bubble compared to the concept of welfare, where there are so many people living in that trap of, no matter how hard I work or how many jobs I have, I still have to choose between sending the kids to school in a clean uniform versus eating versus heating the house, all those kind of things. And it's such a stigmatized thing that people work so hard to cover it up that they don't want to talk about it. I mean, I was chair of governance of our local
I
school.
absolutely agree with that stigma, the stigma point. And the language is really, really important. And I get that. But that's what I'm beginning to hear changing. And, you know, so we need to make sure that we leverage that change, that slight change in understanding and compassion level that I think that this pandemic has brought about. Sorry, you were going to say the governor.
No. Don't worry. Look, I think from my perspective, I think the world's a slightly safer place with people like you sitting at the helm of this and driving it.
I'm not at the helm.
Well,
my driving license has lapsed, but I think that you and I and the credit union movement, and we'll keep trying. We may not change the world, but incrementally, hopefully, and as I said before, it's the new young people coming through who are really the ones we need to back up and support, because they've got it. They've absolutely got it. They know. They listen, they talk, they're not stigmatizing people in the way that perhaps our generation did. They're out there, they understand it, they get it, and they're trying to make it better.
It's an interesting point that you just made there about changing the world. I once got accused of coming to this to try and change the world, and my kind of immediate response back was to go, I'm not trying to change the world. We might, if we're really lucky, change someone's world, and that will be good enough. And I think that's probably the thing that draws me to this sector more than anything else, that they're just there to help people at every possible stage. They do this. They resist the algorithm that will say no. They want the reasons to say yes, and they're going to work around the reasons to say no. And I just think it's such an exciting place to be. It's so seismically different to anything I've ever done before. And I just love it. I love the people in it. I love the ethos of it. And it's great to even have these kind of conversations where people are working so hard to try and fix the problems.
For me, the key message is always, and I mean, I pay the mortgage by doing coaching and communication skills training and so on. And I always say, it's people before processes. If you can put people before the processes, and there's a wonderful Indian proverb that I use that says, I don't care what you know until I know that you care. And that's where this sector is going.
I love that. Absolutely.
It's coming from, is going to, is whatever. So can we please put the processes second and put the people first? And if we can do that, then we'll hear what they have to say. We'll give them a voice. We'll listen to their needs and hopefully manage to, as you say, change some person's world as opposed to, oh, go on, let's try and change the world.
Yeah, the whole world. Why not? It's good. At the end of it, we'll have changed. We'll have changed enough of it. Liz, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for agreeing to come and do one of these podcasts with me. And I'm sure everyone listening to this will have been as captivated as I am about the things that you're doing and listening to all the stuff that's happening. Liz, just want to take the opportunity to say thank you very much. And it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much to everyone for listening to this, and look forward to seeing you all again soon on another podcast from Incuto. Thank you.
Thank you.